Hello, dear readers. I am Phil Svitek, joined alongside Marisa Serafini. And if you're following along on the video side, you know that her tiny book and my big book, they're the same book. It's called Treasure by Clive Cussler. That is the book that we are discussing this month. And we're going to be going into it, giving you the background of the author, getting into the plot, the themes, all that good stuff that you would expect of a book club. And not only that, towards the end, we'll also talk about other books we've been reading off on the side, and we'll give you our reading list, which I guess you can call the summer reading list because we are in the summer. So, some fun
Yeah.
stuff to look forward to. So that's an overview of what we got. It is going to be spoiler filled in that sense, but hey, you know what? If you want to read the book, if you want to pause us, read the book, go ahead and do that. If you just want to dive in, power to you. We don't discourage or disparage. So, without further ado, though, let's kick it to you, Marisa. What did you think? This was your first Clive Cussler, Dirk Pitt adventure.
Adventure story. And I mean, when you first go into the book, you're like, oh man, a terrorist attack. We got a whole plane crash. Like, let's go. I mean, it really just starts you off in the so-called quote unquote adventure. Um, and then, but I think the thing that really got to me was like it was so vividly detailed that I could picture everything. I could picture this guy walking 2 meters to the left and checking the time on his wristwatch. I was like, oh my God. I was like, at first, it was like very descriptive. I was like, okay, great. I can understand the scene. Shit's happening. Shit's going down. And then I was like, but this is a little bit too much detail. And it really kind of at some points really dragged the story. I'm like, I don't need to know how many kilometers depths we're going. Just tell me we're going down deep into the water. That's all I need to know. Um, and a lot of adventure, quote unquotes, were happening side by side. Like this was happening, and then we have to deal with these villains and deal with these politicians. And as I'm reading, I'm like, wait, but who am I supposed to follow? Who's the bigger threat here? Who's the biggest, what would you say, antagonist? And then like there were two big ones, and then another one like completely off. And I was like, how did they all come together? So a lot of things are happening, and I'm like trying to follow everything, but it is so overly descriptive. And I'm like, is this part important? Should I pay attention to this? A lot was happening. I admit, like, a lot was happening. At some point, it did get really hard to follow along. But when you're reading it as a adventure fan, whatever, you're like, okay, yeah, I could see how like this could be adventurous to someone like, hey, at the end of it, there's treasure. Or like we have to deal with politics here and there, but ultimately there's treasure at the end. We're like, okay, I could see how people can enjoy this and how someone could adapt this into a movie or a TV series or something. So I'm like, I get the appeal. I get it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, so this isn't my first book of his, but I will say it's the one that I felt most disappointed by, where you know, all his other books have that sort of intrigue. At least the ones that I've read. I've not read it. We'll talk about the ones he's written, but I've read specifically the Dirk Pitt adventures, who's kind of like this James Bond, Indiana Jones mix. And the setup usually is you get some sort of piece of history as the prologue, and you're like, okay, where's this going to go? Then you get the setup of present day. Then you meet Dirk Pitt, and he has to save the world. And of course, the thing from the prologue ties into what's happening current day, yada yada. But the thing is, it felt a little bit convoluted. It's like A plus B plus C plus, and it just none of it like tied in together of like A into B into C into D.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the kind of big distinction. And I do side with you in the sense of, listen, I think I didn't mind the detail necessarily, but it's like I think there's a couple of chapters we could have, kind of pared down on and just stuck with Dirk. Like it's like we know X, Y, and Z person is doing this and they're doing that. Like we went over the game plan. When things go wrong, let's see it from Dirk's kind of point of view and him having to deal with it. We don't need all like for a Dirk Pitt adventure, he's actually not in it as much as one would hope, which is
Yeah.
yeah, it's a little bit different. I think um when you sort of look at it, he wrote about a new book every 2 years for the Dirk Pitt Adventures. And I think that might have caught up to him. This is the ninth book in the series. and maybe just felt that sort of pressure. And it has all the cast of characters that kind of start to combine, and maybe he's like, well, I think people like the president. I think people like the senator. And it's like, no, we don't give a crap about them.
No, we don't.
So yeah, that's kind of, I think, it's one of those like it, you get caught up in this cycle of having to churn out a book and ultimately maybe not having as many restrictions. And it's like maybe you kind of needed the restrictions because that's what made the earlier books better.
Right. And I think that kind of maybe works against us too, because this is, I don't know what number in the series. We're in the middle of a series. So you can already see some of these characters were probably introduced in a different form beforehand. And when you're reading this middle adventure, like, oh, remember this person? Like, no, I've never met them before ever. So I was getting like, we had this habit of picking stories that have like 20 million characters. I was like, are you important? Do I have to follow you now? Or like, how do you play into this? We got the Venator, we got these two president brothers. And I'm like, who's important? Who do I focus on? And this is so overly detailed with everybody. I'm trying to remember everybody's names in there and their relevance and how they tie into whatever action scene that we are now reading. I'm like, oh my God, it's a lot. It's kind of overwhelming. It's very overwhelming.
It
And
is.
like I get it. Like we've read a lot of adventure stuff. It was like Sherlock Holmes, Sir Conan Doyle was also kind of the Arthur Conan Doyle was kind of the same thing with his Sherlock stories because like usually at the end, and you can kind of see it with this book, usually at the end of an adventure, they kind of like set a little breadcrumb nugget and like sets Sherlock off onto his next adventure. That's like a preface for the next book. Get ready, get excited for that. I kind of got a little bit at the end of this. I was like, oh, is this his next? This is where he's going to next. Do I have to read that one too to make all the sense? I'm like, oh my God. And I think that kind of deters us when we're in middle of series, Phil.
Well, here's the interest. So this is the ninth book. So let's break him down. This is the ninth book, and I'd read other ones. Like the ones I'd read is Vixen 03, which is the fourth book. I've read Pacific Vortex, which is the sixth book. I've read Cyclops, which is the eighth book. That was actually the first book I ever read. And then I read Dragon, which is the next book. Now the thing of it is, like, they are more or less standalone books for the most part. Like, if you think that you're missing out on any other information about the president and the senator and this and that, you literally have it all here. Like, there's nothing different. Like, they are really just caricatures of themselves
Mhm.
in all the other books. You just have, I guess, more of a mental association of like, oh, I've met that person before, therefore I guess I know them. So I think that's the only real difference. But yeah, as far as I mean, if anything, you would have been familiar with Sahara, which is the 11th book. Although you didn't read the book, you did see the movie. That's the Matthew
Yeah.
McConaughey as Dirk Pitt, which is perfect casting, by the way.
And in fairness, I've only seen that movie once, a very long time ago. So do I remember most of it? No, I remember they were in the desert and somehow they found treasure and Penelope Cruz was hot. That's all I remember. So I was like, could I tell you the plot of that movie? Absolutely not.
Yeah, it's kind of a wild plot. I've not read the book itself, but I have seen the movie. And like you, it's been years, and I thought maybe I could try to rewatch it, but just time got away from me. But again, Matthew McConaughey as Dirk Pitt is literally perfect casting.
Okay. I believe you. I don't like I was probably in high school because I was in high school when that movie first came out, and I was probably in high school when the one and only time I watched it. So again, a lifetime ago, I remember not hating it. I remember enjoying it. Um, and I think it's kind of a shame that they only did like, was that like the only one and done that
Yeah, it was kind
Matthew?
of a bomb, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is unfortunate because like that was a fun movie. That's a great casting. Um, and I think Matthew McConaughey could have had like his own, fun adventure series had that done better. He could have been like the Indiana Jones, Dirk Pitt adventure of that series, but unfortunately that didn't. So I think that says, do people enjoy treasure hunt movies as much as we used to back in the 80s, 70s? Who knows?
I don't know. Yeah, I think again, I don't want to get too far into it, but I do remember like as a fan of having read some of the books at that point, I felt a little bit let down by the movie. I was like, probably the book is better. But again, it's tough to say because
Hmm.
it's been a while since I've seen the movie and I've never read Sahara, the actual book, so who knows? Okay, but let's talk about Clive Cussler himself, the author. Quite an interesting guy. And you start to see the autobiographical aspects of Dirk Pitt through him. So he was born in 1931, and he was an underwater explorer. So he was born in Illinois, just like you kind of grew up there.
Yeah.
And
He's from Aurora, which actually I was only like 45 minutes away from Aurora. I'm very familiar with that place.
yeah, so he heard a lot of stories about World War One from his dad. He liked kind of airplanes, and he was an Eagle Scout and so forth. And he enlisted as part of the Air Force during the Korean War and was promoted and things like that. And after his military stuff, he became a copywriter and a creative director for advertising agencies. So this is where sort of the writing aspect starts to come in. And he would actually make a lot of commercials that ended up winning various awards. Now, where sort of the writing comes in is in 1965, his wife, she was away at nights, and after he put the kids down to bed, he was essentially lonely and bored, so he would start writing. And this is kind of where it all really started to take shape, right? And he's been compared to other writers like Michael Crichton. Certainly, sort of, it's got that James Bond aspect to it and stuff like that. And slowly and surely, he starts writing these to the point that by the time he dies, he's had over 20 New York Times bestsellers and had written over 80 books. So, for something that just started off as a hobby, it turned into quite something. Now, the crazy part, so Dirk Pitt is part of this organization, this government organization called NUMA, the National Underwater and Marine Agency, which, believe it or not, is an actual agency that Clive Cussler himself founded. So, yeah, this guy's life is quite intriguing because, like, the love of, like, Dirk Pitt has this love of old cars. That obviously comes from Clive Cussler. Numa,
Hmm.
is a fictionalized version of the real Numa, which have so far kind of unearthed 60 shipwrecks and things of that nature, none of which I sort of know. But, listen, they're out there. They found them, like they're doing good
Right.
work.
I mean, at least he's bringing awareness to it because who knows how many ships have been wrecked over this past centuries and stuff. And it's really because of technology and of the last century that we're really starting to actually like recover and learn more about the history and different types of countries who are involved, how, how just like the lifestyle of the past people before us. So it's good that he has that interest. He's brought it to the forefront, especially 70s, 80s, 90s, where Titanic was probably one of the biggest, more known ones that people know as of late. So it's good that he's kind of at the forefront of bringing that awareness to us because there is a lot of we know there's treasure involved. So someone who brings the historical accuracy and it's like, hey, there's so much in the ocean that we don't know. Like, let's find out about all these shipwrecks, and it brings awareness to people that um are very interested in that subject.
Yeah, and I would argue people only know the Titanic as like the shipwreck.
Right, exactly.
So, absolutely. So that covers most of his life. He did sadly pass away in February of 2020, but left quite a legacy and stuff like that. Again, a very fascinating person in general. But let's get into the actual plot itself. So why don't we break it down kind of let's start with the treasure itself. So this is the treasure of Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, give me sort of your thoughts on just, you know, any which way you want to sort of slice and dice it, I guess.
I mean, okay, first of all, hopefully most people know who Alexander the Great is. And if you don't really know his whole reign, at least you know like some historical facts that, he just took over basically everyone and demolished people with his amazing military tactics and stuff like that. So you can imagine how much like his I don't even know his reign, his empire, he has plundered, and all the things, all the people he's encountered, all the places he's been, all the wealth that he has probably crossed, like came across during all of his battle overtakes and stuff. You're like, oh yeah, there's got to be something that he's holding, and with all the stuff that he has seen in his life, for sure there's probably treasure somewhere that he's buried. So you want to learn more about that. That's interesting. Um, and just like knowing the relevance of big conquerors, they love holding on to their treasure. So it makes it very realistic. They're like, oh yeah, of course there's treasure somewhere. Of course it'd be tied to him, one of the greats.
Yeah. And so there ends up being essentially this guy, Junius Vena, Venator, who essentially, has a group of Romans. They travel and, they get shipwrecked or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, what happened to it and where are they, right? So that's kind of the first mystery that we're presented. Now, we meet Dirk Pitt when he's searching for essentially a submarine that got sunk, and they're trying to do it secretly before the Russians. And that
Hmm.
leads us to a plane hijacking of the UN, the newest sort of installment of the UN Secretary General, which is Hala Kamil, of Egyptian descent. And yes, that is important to the plot. So
Yeah.
yeah, I guess take us there. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, and this is like the starting of the convoluted storm that is this book, because so much is happening. And I love how you're also kind of refreshing my memory, because again, it was very overwhelming. Um, so it's kind of like Clive is doing his own thing illegally and very secretive in that way. And it's like, oh, coincidentally, something else is happening. Let's go figure this out. Like, oh, we're just conveniently here. Now this becomes our main objective. And you're like, this is me as a reader. It's like, what's more important right now? This Russian submarine, or the submarine that they're trying to evade the Russians, or this new hijacking plane that he now has to focus on? And I'm like,
Well,
what's more important? What's more relevant?
well, that's Dirk Pitt for you. He's like, listen, we're gonna save the people. I don't care what the priority for the U.S. government is. We will not let people die on my watch.
Right. I was like, we have the means, we have the crew, we see this plane, let's go help them.
Yep. So that and so essentially the plane ends up crashing, and they're crashing because it's been hijacked by these essentially assassins of fanatics of the Middle East, more specifically Egypt. By the way, this is all fictitious, so don't all of a sudden feel like any of
Right.
us are lecturing you on Middle East politics here. Um, and lo and behold, they're not other people also see what's happening, aka the amazingly smart, brilliant, but also not to be forgotten, very attractive Dr. Lily Sharp.
Of course. I mean, you have to have the female romantic interest, or at least a female figure to play opposite of said Dirk Pitt.
Well,
I'm for
here's
her. She was awesome. I liked her. She knew her ish.
not, I know this is, and maybe this is like in the tone of the book that I'll skip around as well, but I do want to kind of, when we talk about the kind of convoluted aspect of it, we're talking about Dr. Lily Sharp, right? That's like, okay, cool, you get it, blah, blah, blah. And yet, She is not the only one. So again, this is kind of skipping ahead, but I do want to get your thoughts on like the dual sort of two women, Lily being a little bit younger, sure, Hala
Mm.
being a little bit older, but apparently still very gorgeous. And Dirk just he just gets with
Kind of
both of them like it's
like,
nothing.
well, I mean, he's the adventurous dude. I could get why women of all ages and types would want to be with him. Um, my thing was, and this is just terrible, but maybe this is just the American conditioning in me, is that when we saw Lily, brilliant, she's smart, she knows her shit, she knows her languages, she knows her history. I was like, yeah, I like you, cool, awesome. And then we get Hala, and we figure out like this whole attack was because of her. You're like, oh, you're a problem already. Like all these innocent people also died because of you. You're in a position of power. Yes, you work for the UN, and but I'm
You
like,
talk
oh,
about
this is
Hala.
already yes, huh? I was like, this is already messy. This cannot be good if you start a relationship with a politician. Yeah, you really can't. So I was already for Lily,
Hmm.
and anything that happened, quote unquote, happened didn't happen with Hala and Dirk. I was like, yeah, no, because we knew it wasn't gonna happen. We knew that was temporary. We knew Lily was endgame.
Well, my thing with it was that we kind of sidelined Lily for a good chunk of it. Like, she was on the adventure for the first, let's say, fourth to a third. Then two-thirds in, we don't see her, and then we get her at the end, and kudos, and she's there, but she's not really doing anything as much as she could, right? So
Right.
that was my sort of I just wanted like she seemed very
I
capable of
wanted
being able
more.
to do stuff, you know?
Yeah, I wanted more. I completely agree because at the end, she like we literally finished with her. She's in the last
She
sentence.
finished too.
Yeah, she did. Cool. Um, but when I'm reading like literally the end of the book, I'm thinking to myself, did we get enough time with her to have this relationship fully come to fruition and they get enough time with us to make this relationship quote unquote believable? And that's where I'm like, oh, I feel like we were robbed of time with her. Like she could have, like you said, been in the story more because we saw her, she went away, and then we saw her again. I was like, that wasn't enough time for me to build this genuine relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a bit of a letdown, but to get back to the plot at hand, so one of the things we learned is that there was essentially two different assassins hired at the same time to try to bring down this plane. And here's where it really kind of you start to piece all this stuff together, but just to lay it all out, there are two brothers, one that lives in Mexico, one that lives in Egypt. They want to topple the governments, and they are presenting themselves as these fake messiahs, right? And so they've
Hmm.
got their fake messiah names, which is Yazid and Topoldzin, I think is how you say it. But they are not who they say they are. They are of the Capasteri family, which is a mob organization. So it's like when you talk about all the characters already, I'm like, holy effing crap. Like, what are even the brothers' names? And they
Right.
do an
That's like
interchanging.
they have three different identities right now. We got their real names, which we really don't know. We got their
Paul and
fake
Robert.
names. Yeah. They're like we got their fake names who they're posing as, and their quote unquote posing fronts, fakes, identity for facades are posing as someone else. Like the hell, I'm so confused.
Yeah, they would literally interchange the names of like, Paul did this, and then Dirk did this, and Yazid did this. And I'm like, wait, isn't Yazid Paul? Just stick with
Right.
one name.
Stick. Oh my God.
Yeah, that was
I
a
couldn't
little.
even keep them straight. And then like when we were going from like Hala to these guys, I'm like, who's more important? Who are we should be focusing right now? Like I was very lost in this book. Very, very, and that's not a good thing. When I can't even keep track, that's not a good thing.
Yes. So essentially, the whole notion from them was to destabilize, I guess, the UN, so that way Egypt could have a special election and Mexico could have a special election. and
Hmm.
these fanatics could win. That's kind of the backdrop. And really, the main plot of it is that these assassination attempts keep failing. So we have the airplane. Then later on, we have Hala as like this fake uh, that's kind of going around, but the real one is at Senator Dirk Pitt, which is Dirk Pitt's father, which isn't confusing at all when they just keep saying Pitt. Just like, wait, Dirk or the senator?
He's like, I'm also worried about my father. He's on this ship that we lost contact with twice. I'm like, okay, so now we have to worry about like getting his father back. I'm like, who are we supposed to be focusing on?
Yes, but the backtrack. So basically,
Yes.
Hala is still at she's in Colorado at the senator's house. But then the assassins come there. Dirk Pitt happens to be there, and they save them, but they wreck Pitt's car. And then the big thing happens, which I thought would be the last big thing that would happen. It won't be. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this is where we get the whole ship hijacking aspect, which is cool. I thought this was a good set piece overall, if you want to look at it like that.
Yeah, sure, you're on a ship. Of course you're going to be taken over. Like, and then I'm like, of course, because it wouldn't be an adventure if people weren't attacking you and trying to, like all these, remember the pirates? Like, I don't know. It's like, I couldn't even tell anymore. I was like, okay, here's another obstacle for us to deal with. And I'm like, okay, adventure, sure. It's like just like one thing after the next. It was exhausting. It's like one situation after the next.
Well, the reason I like this part in particular, so essentially, there's a conference in South America, and lo and behold, we have Hala there, we have the Mexican and Egyptian presidents there, and so there's this whole gathering, but they're the ones that get kidnapped, and by extension, the senator, aka Dirk's father, gets kidnapped because he's there on a special mission from the president. Yes, this is a run-on sentence, but I'm trying to keep it as short as possible.
This
Um,
whole book was a run-on book.
but the reason I like this part of it most was because it gave Dirk the most stuff to do where he's using his brains and his knowledge of like, oh, the ship is still alive. And in fact, they're hiding, and this is how they're hiding, and this is how we get to them, blah, blah, blah. So I did
Mhm.
enjoy that aspect of it most.
Yeah, and I admit this is what I did enjoy about the details where they're like telling us all the technical things that they're doing while on the ship. They're like, hey, we have to get to this degree, nautical degree by how many kilometers. So just we can get in signal range to contact said ships and like the correct people who we need to like get our messages out to. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense because they're bearing right now. They can't because glacial things are in the way that's blocking the frequencies. Like, yeah, that makes sense. And that's what I appreciate, the technology. I was like, I wouldn't be like, why can't they? It's like, and you got to remember this, the story was in the 80s and our technology up to date would find this stuff like almost immediately. And but you got to take it back 30, 40 years. It's like, all right, back then they would have taken some time to find lost people, lost ships. Yeah, it's going to take a minute. So I appreciated that aspect. Like I could visually see why it was hard to lose. Like hard losing, always losing contact with people. So
Yeah. And so essentially what it comes down to is that they mask themselves and they realize where the boat is because they essentially attach themselves to an iceberg looking like an iceberg. And so they were hard to detect. Lo and behold, we find them, and so they plan this whole sort of raid. Um, and that to me felt like the final set piece. It really did. It's like, okay, cool, we're gonna save
you
all
would
these
think,
people and so forth. And there's enough there, right? Like, I mean, we're talking like 100 pages just on the raid itself.
right? And you and I have different types of books, so like our layout's a little bit different. And when I'm reading the scene and everything that's going down, and not to jump ahead, but like when like the shoot down, the shootout happens and stuff, I'm like, oh, I still have 100 more pages to read. What else is gonna happen? I was like, huh, we're still going. Next adventure. Or the
Yeah,
adventure continues. Like, oh my God, there's so much happening.
Yeah, so this is where for me, it's like I really felt like we could have wrapped it up somehow, and we should have somewhere
Yeah.
here where it all comes together. But no, everyone's saved. Dirk gets to sleep with Hamala, but then gets to reunite with Lily. And off that treasure that we talked about, guess what? Now we're going to focus on that. And for some reason,
Hmm.
so's everyone else. And that's how we save the world.
It's like, oh, hey, that was also on this important thing that like was brought up to our attention that we spent a lot of time on. We're going to put that on the back burner. Now that we got this UN situation done, now we're going to go back to this. And as a reader, I'm like, what's more important right now? What are we focusing on? What's our priority? And then we're going back. I was like, all right, this treasure, that's always still there. They still haven't found it.
Yeah.
The
So
book is called Treasure. We got to find the treasure.
yes, indeed. So the treasure's in Texas on the border of U.S. and Mexico. Who would have thought? And essentially, one of the brothers dies, but at the hand of the assassin that, is pissed because they were essentially put out to dry through
Yeah.
this whole thing. And then, yeah, so now we got to deal with the other brother. We've, essentially like there's a whole mob that's just like crossing the border into the US, quite literally.
Now we're
Uh,
dealing with illegal aliens crossing. Like, oh great, that we opened up a whole nother no, whole nother problem. Oh my God.
yes,
Keep going,
indeed.
sorry.
No, all good. And then I don't quite still understand what fully happens, what the trickery is, but essentially they lure the last of the brothers, the one from, that's pretending to be an Aztec king, into this cave of
Hmm.
treasures. And Dirk's essentially going to kill him somehow. But then it gets complicated because the killer of the other brother shows up, and you would think that perhaps Dirk and him would be on the same page, enemy of my enemy, sort of a thing. It doesn't quite end up being that way, but it does in the end. Hoorah! And the treasure's recovered, and Lily and of course Dirk spend the night, and Lily wonders, will it be forever or just a blip in time?
Yeah, maybe it's just they got caught up in the adventure. Um, and also like the mob crossing the border, that I felt that was quickly wrapped up too. They're like, yeah, we caught them, and then they all got like sent back to the ones that they did get caught are like now being held in jail, prison, and then the ones that were like getting away have already been relocated back. And I'm like, okay, and they literally brushed over that. And I'm like, okay, I guess that's not a problem anymore. Like, oh my God.
Yeah,
Like, okay.
it was one of those. There was a lot of moments, especially with the U.S. president, where again, I didn't need him to be like three steps. I wanted more of a focus on Dirk, but like the idea that, there were certain things that the president knew he didn't want to do, but in order to like cover his ass, he needed to like say something. But he knew that like his commander, whatever his actual title is, wouldn't actually shoot at the illegal aliens, and therefore like people would be saved, but the president had to give that order. Otherwise, there would be pandemonium. And it's like, okay, that's just too much politics into. We just want an adventure book.
There was a lot of politics in this, and then I can kind of, and again, I haven't read any other Clive Cussler books, but reading this, and we have so many literally different nations involved. Him as a writer, you can read it, be like, how many people does he not want to offend right now? Like now we were talking about the Mexican and Egyptian heritage, terrorists from the Middle East, and then now all these illegal people are crossing from Mexico, and like we're the Americans, like we're just trying to keep people out, but we also don't want to say that either. Like he's bringing up so many problems from other countries, but also yet really, really glossing the fact he's trying not to be racist.
Yeah, I
I'm like,
mean,
I got a lot of that in this book.
the other books are much more simpler because it's like, for example, Cyclops is about essentially the US having built a secret base on the moon that's been there for like 40 years and no one knows about it, but the Russians are about to find out. So the president's like, do what you gotta do so the Russians don't find out about us. you know? So it's much more
Uh,
simple in that sense.
Right.
Uh,
Was it just like one country? Because this one we dealt with several. So
yeah, I mean, yeah, the other ones, yeah. So you're usually dealing with like Russia, or like Dragon is dealing with like Japan and stuff like that. So it's like it's
okay.
at its best when you're just dealing
It's
with
like
one country.
yeah, it's pretty singular and contained in this way. It's like no, like I'm just and we're traveling all across the world. I'm like, okay, where are we now? Like
Yeah.
we were in Antarctica at one point. I'm like, we're like where in the world are we? I was very lost and confused in this book.
That was the thing about the
Like, my
treasure.
God.
It was like, okay, the whole part about the treasure is we found these essentially doubloons or whatever the hell they were. We found them in Iceland,
Yeah.
Greenland, somewhere there, but the treasure ends up being in Texas. It's like,
Yeah.
what? I
Oh, of course.
square that for me, you know?
Right. Of course it's in Texas. That makes sense. That's more convenient for us. And Texas is so close to Mexico. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
I did laugh when they were like, there were some elements of obvious convenience where it's like all this land where this amazing treasure is on, it's owned by one person because he owns like a bajillion acres, and he's like, totally, just give me $1 million and it's all yours.
Yeah. Yeah. And problem solved. Throw money at it.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So I don't know,
My head hurts. My brain hurts, Phil. This one like really kept me like thinking a lot. Like, okay, I'm getting there.
this is it. I will say it's even more
Exhausting.
convoluted than the Da Vinci Code,
Yeah, it's
because again,
exhausting.
at least with the Da Vinci Code, you go from A to B to C. This was just like, again, A is random, but so is B, and somehow we're gonna so
Somehow they meet in the middle, which ended up being Texas.
yes.
Uh,
So
shoot.
yeah, I would say, listen, there are other books that are better in the Dirk Pitt series. This one,
Okay.
unfortunately, a letdown. Yes, you will get the political intrigue. You will get the misogyny.
Mm-hmm. We'll get the
Um,
racism too.
you will get yes, you will get
Yeah.
all those things, but it will be much more streamlined in all those areas.
Yeah,
So,
gotcha. I hope so. I would say, as a person who has never read the Dirk Pitt series, this is not one you start off with. There's a reason why it's a series. You start off with number one. So I'm actually now more curious to go back to number one and see how if they're more self-contained. Because hopefully at number nine, like you've gained your fandom, you've gained your audience that kind of know your format. Switch it up a little bit, get it a little bit more complicated. And I felt this one was very complicated to start off with. 9 books later could maybe someone could follow, but not at the
I
beginning.
don't
Not
know.
at the
Again,
beginning.
I've read a lot of them, and yeah, like I think you would like Pacific Vortex or like Vixen 03. I think you would like they're just much more streamlined. Like I
Okay, good. That's
Vixen
promising.
Vixen 03 is essentially, they discover that atomic bombs have been stolen from this boat. And guess what? The evildoers want to ram a boat secretly into Washington with all the nukes. Go.
Oh shoot.
Like pretty straightforward.
That's your main problem.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah, but yeah, I think there was a good story here. It just,
Yeah.
yeah, if we just focused them more on Dirk and streamlined it, it could have been better, but
Right. I mean,
So,
reading it, you had your clear action scenes. You had your villains for the most part. Like, okay, you're bad, you're good, you're helpful. We're here. This is happening. If you formulate it into a TV show, into a movie, adapted in that way, you can understand where the adventure comes in. Like, yeah, that'd be fun to watch and see that plays out. But reading it, all in the midst of UN politics, terrorism, shootouts, glacial explosions, shoot, it's a lot of information to take in. It really
yeah,
is.
it is.
And I like to think I'm intelligent and I can follow a pretty complex story, but this was a little bit too much.
Yes.
He could have like cut out two, three big things.
Yeah, I really think if the ending had just been combined, like the whole finding of the ship is also somehow finding of the treasure, we would have been good. Keep Lily active throughout. And,
Yeah.
yes, Hala Camille, she's very grateful, but she doesn't need to like sleep with him.
Yeah. And
And we could have been
that's a
good.
very like James Bond kind of aspect too. Like he's just a womanizer and will sleep with like anyone who wants to get in his pants and stuff. And you're like, but every story there's this the one main one that you're supposed to focus on. The other ones are just not to sound terrible, like side pieces. They're flings, they're fun. Whatever.
Yes, it was her way of showing thank you for saving me literally 800
Yeah.
times.
Yeah. Over and over and over again.
Indeed. All right.
Woo.
Well, any final thoughts about your first Dirk Pitt adventure? It
Oh my
was
goodness. I think I I think I mentioned most of it. I understand the fun and adventure. Eventually you gotta like stick with it to get to the treasure at the end. So there is a big reward. Like it did come to a fun conclusion in that way. But man, you gotta go through a lot of crap to get through it. Um I'm curious to actually read the other ones. Will I read them immediately? Probably not. But I wouldn't this book didn't deter me from reading the other
hmm,
ones. I'm actually interested. It's a fun adventure book. Keep just simple, like keep it more simplistic for
yeah.
other readers who just wants to read a series.
Yeah, and again, it's ironically as much as we're talking about it, that it's a little bit these books, again, they're meant to be just pick it up at the airport type of a book, like the Michael Crichtons, the Robin
Hmm.
Cooks, the Dan Browns,
The
perhaps,
James Pattersons.
yeah, the Tom
Yeah,
Clancy's,
Tams.
all that,
Hmm.
where it's just like, here you go. It's the blockbuster of books. Turn off your brain. Stuff's happening, you know, set it and forget it.
Yep.
You know,
Here's an adventure for 3 hours.
exactly. So, yeah, for that, I think it's like there's enough fun stuff there overall. It just could have been a little bit elevated, that's all. So,
Way more concise.
indeed. But that is what we have. I like to equate this book, if I had to give it some sort of nautical tie-in, it's like if you ever get caught in a wave and you're trying to orient yourself because it's just taking you every which way. That's kind of what reading this book feels like. You know, you're on the
Yeah.
wave. It's going to lead you somewhere. You're pretty sure it's going to lead you to some land eventually. Now, whether
Right.
it's the rocks of death or the beach of salvation, you'll find out.
Ride the wave.
You
Ride
know,
the wave.
so there you go.
No, I agree.
All right. Well, without further ado, let's switch topics to what you've been reading besides Treasure.
Oh my gosh. Well, I've been really busy in the past month, so quite honestly, I haven't been reading as much, but I do have other books lined up as I look I because this one was such a like well, let's say more testosterone driven masculine kind of adventure. I need to like lean more into my romance a little bit. So I have Divine Rivals and love theoretically, which are like more romance. I need to balance myself out, Phil. This was a lot. So those are my next two books that
There
I'm
you
going to
go.
be reading.
I like the math of that. For every girl Dirk Pitt sleeps with is another novel.
Yep, yep. I had my adventure. Now I get my romance. So, balance.
There you go. At some point, I've not actually ever read an Ian Fleming book, so that would be interesting.
There you go.
I mean, I've obviously seen plenty of the movies, but
Hmm.
never read the book, so it would be interesting to go to the source
Okay.
and see how that compares and contrasts to some of this stuff.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Anything? So those are that's it. Those are
Those
the
are the
two.
two as of right now.
Cool.
Yeah, my personal life, I was kind of focusing on other things. So that kind of, now that I'm done with this book, I can get back
All
to reading in my downtime.
all
So,
good. I love how for Marissa, it's like, oh, okay, she read 3 books total for this month. I guess that's a down month for Marissa.
It is. It really is. Because all my free time I was training for Krav Maga, and now that that's done, like that big hurdle in my life is done. Now I can like legit take 2 hours to read a book again
There you
instead of
go.
working out.
I've
So
been the book that I sort of revisited, and I'm kind of skimming a bunch of various ones, but the one in particular is Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. It's a very condensed sort of version of all the other books that exist out there and stuff like that. So I'm doing it for research. And yeah, I love Neil Gaiman, and obviously he's a huge fan of mythology, specifically Norse mythology. So yeah, it's a great book. Is it the end all be all? No. It's like a gateway drug, if you will.
yeah, no, I've heard of that book. Because you and I were both fans of Neil Gaiman, so that one's been on my list for a while. So let me know how it is. I'm very interested.
I mean, it's very much it's a nonfiction book. So
Right.
obviously it tells the
It's
stories of
information
the
heavy.
mythology, and it does so in an entertaining way. But I wouldn't say it's like, the telling of the myths through fictionalized aspects
It's not the
necessarily.
Bible of Norse mythology.
Yeah. So it's a little bit it skews more academic than it does pure entertainment. So.
Okay, that's good.
But yeah, I mean, it's still a great book. It's just, yeah, just wanted to make sure people weren't expecting, you know, something different.
Hmm.
But so that's what I've been doing. Let's talk about what we've got coming up. Kick us off.
Yes, for July, because we're officially in the summer months, we're going to be reading The Beach by Alex Garland. I still haven't read it, but I'm very excited. And that's another quote unquote adventure book, but something happens. There's a whole shift in said adventure, and things go down, things happen. You're like, oh, what do we do? It's one of those kind of books. We've seen a lot of his movies, you and I, that have been adapted in a lot of his stories that have been adapted into movies and stuff. So I'm more excited to read this one because I think we there's usually like a mysterious psychological element to all of his stories. So I'm excited for that. So that'll be our summer fun but yet not fun kind of adventure.
Well, there you go. And then after that, in August, we've got Elder Race. Um, so it's a very thin book overall. It's it's interesting. It has a lot of like world building aspects, things of that nature. So yeah, it should be a fun sci-fi fantasy mix, but with an easy breezy feel to it. So
That's good.
one hopes, we'll see
Yeah.
ultimately. And then
Quite
it's
honestly, I have yet to decide what to read in September. I haven't focused that far ahead in the future. So hopefully by next discussion, I'll have a choice for us.
all right.
But you
Well,
already have our choice.
yeah. So in October, Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Inspector. Um, this should be a good book. It's you know, it's a woman author, but it's also a foreign woman author. But if you're, as I understand it, if you're like a fan of things like Pride and Prejudice, like it plays on that sort of level of storytelling. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, it should be interesting. A lot of good reviews for it. So we'll see.
Well, I admit I am a woman. I do love Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice. So you had me.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm excited for that.
Right on. I'm trying to balance my Dirk Pitt adventures with the Jane
Yes.
Austen of the
Thank you.
world.
I appreciate it. It helps me too.
Yes, indeed. So there you go. Maybe in December we'll do Ian Fleming since I brought it up.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, who's gonna stop you? I probably won't. I'd be open to Ian. So
Cool, cool. Well, there you go. So that's what we've got coming up. Keep reading. Let us know what you're reading at home, Give us books for your reading list. The famous catchphrase of ours is we do read it, or we read the comments. The books do get added to the list, but the list is quite long.
yeah,
So
rebuilding a library.
We are indeed. It's always easier for me to watch a movie that someone recommends versus reading a
Read
book,
a book.
So
Yeah,
the books get much more backlogged than the movies.
right. And books are bigger commitments, let's be real. So
Yes. Anyway,
that's okay.
thank you as always for taking the time. At Serafini TV is where you can catch up and read up on Marisa,
That's
unintended.
right.
And I'm at Phil Svitek. I'll see you next time.